Hi everyone. Today I'm talking to Peter about the mobilizing function. Now, for those of you that don't know what the mobilizing function is, in Model A, which is the way in which we structure different types in socionics, there are 8 functions. These are known as leading, a creative, a role, vulnerable, suggestive, mobilizing, ignoring, and demonstrative. Now, in the mobilizing, number 6, this is one which is characterized by being something which we value, but something which we start off being quite weak in, but then over time, with development, can get better at and grow in our strength and capability. It could be seen as being sort of like a secondary motivator behind the main motivator, the leading function. But it could also lead to sort of more cocky, sort of overconfident behaviors. It can lead the person to sort of bite off more than they can chew, can fall flat on their face, and can then lead to further withdrawal. So, Peter, what would you say made you want to talk more about the mobilizing function? What have been some new reflections and revelations for you about this function?
Well, not new for me, because this is something I've been thinking for a while. But I think it's an interesting subject which hasn't really been emphasized in discussions I've seen in the past, or if it hasn't been emphasized, it hasn't been emphasized correctly. For instance, I haven't really checked this recently, but there for some time there was a focus on the mobilizing function being described as the hidden agenda, right? So I don't know if this is still a popular term or people still refer to it, whereby, as the name suggests, would be a motivation of the types which wasn't that obvious, because the both obvious motivations would be in principle, or mostly more obvious influences would be related to the ego functions. But the mobilizing function, called the hidden agenda, as I mentioned for some time ago, proposed that actually, apart from what was obvious and the person's motivations, person's driving preferences, driving needs, main ways of looking at the world, there was this this motivation which was hidden, but was also maybe overarching. And for some time, I mean, there was discussions in I mean, that's what I'm talking about years ago, maybe not recently, because I haven't really been checking them, but where some people went the other way, and they focused too much on the hidden agenda, and they started to even consider the mobilizing function as being stronger or more visible than the ego functions. And okay, in some cases it may be more visible, but you have been to, but usually also in conjunction with the ego functions, right? So one has to be careful about this. And and some time ago, I noticed that maybe a more useful way of looking at mobilizing function, or actually was the or not a usual way to look into it. Let me correct this. Another manifestation, which I hadn't really seen mentioned elsewhere, was that the mobilizing function is where we tend to behave in the most, I'll say, pathetic way. And by that, what I mean is that not everybody will behave in a pathetic way very often, hopefully.
Mm.
And not everybody has a problem with the mobilizing function. But when people behave in a pathetic way, and I'll elaborate on that, it tends to be around the mobilizing function. Sometimes also with the dual seeking function, the suggestive function, the fifth function, but sometimes basically on the two either function, on the fifth and the sixth, but more likely on the mobilizing function. And this is something which I observed, and I found it interesting because it does. I think it does is confirmed by observation, at least in my what I observed, and I still think it's something interesting and useful, right, to note. So, but I haven't really. I have maybe collected more data in terms of observation, but I really haven't come to any near original concepts based on that.
Yes. Okay, makes it. There's a question being brought up by True Generations. I think that's Damon, saying, "Isn't the mobilizing function inert? Why would it be so apt to grow and develop if it's an inert function?" I have my thoughts in that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Peter?
Can you repeat the question? I couldn't get it.
Isn't the mobilizing function inert as opposed to contact? And why would it be so apt to grow and develop if it's an inert function?
Well, I mean, look, what I'm trying to, but I don't see these things in such black and white, right? Yes, and I suspect this is I don't see these things in black and white. I see there's a mutual. That's I think it's a mistake to place the functions in so clear boxes, because I would have the impression that the implicit thinking might be, okay, all that counts is to look at the ego functions, and you never see the ID functions. I think that's a fundamental error, right? That's what I'll say. So then we have a disagreement. So that's how I would answer the question. And the point I'm making is that any person, in any individual, we can see all of the elements being used, all of the function, right?
Yes.
And people are going to and their use is more and their use is visible in all and King. That's what makes us human. The differences in using the functions is much more subtle than just suggesting, okay, well, one particular function is to be inert, and then it means it will always be inert. I think what counts really, I mean, precisely because a person is not inclined to use the mobilizing function as much as an ego functions, is that when the person does use the mobilizing function or tries to use them or feel the need to compensate for them, that they're more likely to appear clumsy, right? That's how I would answer this question.
Okay. I also have some thoughts on it, in that I think, and I've seen the inert and contact dichotomy being defined as inert doesn't grow and develop, whereas contact is open to growing and developing. I think that's wrong. I don't think that makes much sense. If you think of, I mean, if you think of some function, it's meant to be at least starting off weak, and it's meant to be valued. And the idea is that it's not quite as weak as the weakest of functions. It implies some degree of change and some degree of willing change for it to get at least stronger and more capable. Why would it be some sort of agenda unless there's some sort of shift or growth? Now, I think instead inert and contact need to be understood or defined differently. The way in which I've tried to define it differently has been stubborn versus flexible. And I think it's the idea, but it goes into what you said before, Peter, about being pathetic, that the mobilizing function is something which is asserted. It's something which you try to do, and you want to be the one doing it. You don't want other people doing it. You want to have ownership of this particular thing you're trying to push and develop it. And sometimes you're trying to claim ownership in something even though you're not actually competent at doing it yet. So it can make you look like a fool. Someone who is very humble about something won't look like a fool if they're trying to use it. It's those who you bring it across in a very sort of cocky way, that very sort of self-confident way, for it to then fail, that creates that appearance of it being pathetic, of them falling flat on their face. And so I think for that to happen, you do need a certain amount of stubbornness. You need enough self-belief in what you're doing for it to look ridiculous when you're then shown to be wrong, to have that self-belief. So a misplaced arrogance or confidence. That, I think, is why I would call it inert, in that I call something which is inert stubborn. And if it's not inert, if it's contact, I call it more flexible, more about adjusting and developing according to the demands of the situation, what other people are actually offering, what other people are suggesting to change it. Yes. So
yeah.
Hello.
Sorry, shall I go or?
Oh yeah. Go ahead. What do you what would be your thoughts on that, Peter?
No. Look, yes. I mean, what the mobile. I would say the following. As you say, mobilizing function actually is one. I'll shift. I will shift what I'm going to say in other ways. Maybe
Yes.
a way of phrasing, of thinking about that, is looking at Quadra, as Quadra values. The mobilizing function is one of the 4 functions which are Quadra values. Are the elements that we consider as more important than the elements which are not of the Quadra values. Now, of course, the ego functions are those which are your main focus, or your main thoughts are based around them, and those are where you are more comfortable and you feel more reassured in them, which is that when you do use them, which of course is, I agree, it is most of the time, you're not going to be clumsy, or usually you're going to be quite confident in how you use them and quite skilled, which are not the same thing, of course. The id functions, which are the other, the remaining, no, that's, sorry, make some attempt, the super id function, isn't it? The 5th and the 6th functions, which are your Quadra values. You also value them, and however, you are more aware of your confidence, lack of skill in them, whereby in the 5th function, which is suggested function, you are more at peace with your weakness, with your lack of confidence in them, or to use another term, with your one-dimensionality in it, to use the dimensionality terms. You are more at peace with that. You are more likely to feel comfortable in asking others about or asking external input on this, or external help, which is also why you can be rigid with your 5th function but you are not likely to come across as overcompensating for it, which is, of course, one of the things I mean to is being pathetic. In the case of the mobilizing function, which is a Quadra value, where you are not as confident as you wish you were. Everybody would like to be better. I think that's the key. Everybody would like to be better at your mobilizing function than you think you are. Actually, and sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you are actually more skilled in using your mobilizing function than you think you are. Right? It's a function which is the base of your one of the bases for the self-esteem, or on the other hand, or the basis for having a chip on your shoulder, right? And that's precisely what makes you pathetic. So and that is why sometimes they offer a clue to the person's type, if you can see that that if you see that this function is coming to the surface, right, in a sort of clumsy way, which will be very different from how the use of this element comes across when somebody uses it who has it as an ego function. It comes or actually as a or a strong function, because again, I mean, because then you have the 8 function, which is a strong one, which you just think is sort of pointless. And actually, elaborating on that a bit, there is a sort of complication between the 6th and the 8th function. The 6th and the 8th function are opposites of each other, because the more you can, of course, use 100% of the 6th and 0% of the 8th, or vice versa, or you can use 50% of the 5th and 50% of the 8th. But the more you use the one, the less you use the other, for a very simple reason, because they are necessarily of elements which are mutually contradictory. And by that, I mean, for instance, for instance, in the case of, if you have, in the case of the ILE, the 6th function is extroverted feeling, or the attitude of emotions, and the 8th function is extroverted thinking, business thinking, or ENP. And the more, by definition, by concept, the more you use extroverted feeling in a given situation, by definition, the less we use extroverted thinking, because the two they occupy the same space. So the more you use the one, the less you use the other. And in the case, for instance, of SI and II, they both have introverted feeling as a 6th function. Sorry. They both have introverted thinking as a 6th function and introverted feeling as 8th function. Introverted feeling, introverted thinking, the same thing. That's logic and relationships, L and R. The more you use the one, you use the other. They are mutually exclusive, right? And of course, nobody only uses one or only uses the other. But the thing is that, for instance, sticking with SCI and II, and that's to give an example, because our introverted feeling is the 8th function of the SCI and the II, which is a very strong function. It is something that SCIs, IIs do very well, and they're very confident in it. And it is also, to use is also the maximum dimensionality, which is basically to understand personal relationships between individuals, right? How to to understand the attitude between several individuals. Something that I find naturally very, very easy to do. However, on the other hand, because they find it so easy, they tend to dismiss it as something of less importance. It's sort of they take it for granted. What SCIs and IIs deep down would prefer would be to be more logical, right? To be able to understand things logically, and a stereotypical, and to use stereotypes, not stereotypes, actually, to use examples. And that explains why it's not uncommon at all to see both SCIs and IEIs with a deep interests in mathematics. Quite a few of them, it's not uncommon to see lectures on mathematics or of this type, because they enjoy it, or in the case of IEIs, maybe more likely to see IEIs who are very interested in philosophy. They feel, they see understanding things, we choose introverted thinking as more of an accomplishment, more of a something which gives them self-esteem, because the opposite R for them is something, they don't even see that as a skill. We tend not to see the function as a skill. We tend to think it's something with something, okay, that's easy. And that, so, however, of course, by doing that, but when you are tried to focus on a mobilizing function, because it is something that you wish you were better than you are, I think actually it's a constant. I think it's almost impossible for somebody to feel, okay, I'm completely happy with where I am with my extroverted, with my sixth function. There is always going to be a feeling that you are not quite there yet. And that's precisely, and you are pathetic on this, because you often fall into two traps when dealing with your mobilizing function. Either you boast about it too much as an overcompensation, or you tried to call attention too much to how good you are into that, to reassure yourself, but you're not really so good. Or the opposite, you ask too much for reassurance from others, that to show that you are good in that you become pathetic for doing that, right? So you look in both ways, either because you are trying to prove to yourself and others how good you are into that, or by continuously asking for reassurance in that, which is also something pathetic. The best way of dealing with your as an advice, possibly the best way from a social point of view to deal with mobilizing function, is basically be aware of the limitations on that, and and not draw attention to those the limitations. Basically, you keep it, and arguably that maybe that's what we do most of the time, right? Which is why it's not, you don't necessarily spot the use of the mobilizing function a person the moment you meet them. You have to, is something you observe on a person over a period of time, and then you realize, okay, this person is behaving in a pathetic way. It's probably related to the mobilizing function. That's
okay. I think that one thing I would query about that, Peter, is where someone is going around seeking reassurance and validation in the mobilizing function. I wonder about that. I know when I think of, for instance, many EIIs, where they often go around seeking validations in the extroverted logic area, which would be their suggestive function. I can't think of any immediate examples where at least in my experiences, there's been someone seeking validation on their mobilizing function so much as their suggestive function.
Well, let me give an example of, okay, maybe maybe we're talking about different things. I'm talking about seeking validation. Let me give an example, right? Because, for instance, I forgot, right? But exactly when or where. But I was seeing I was seeing a documentary about, or a news, a small documentary about people in some people meeting in Monaco, right? And there was a meeting of people who drive Ferraris, right? Obviously, if you can afford a Ferrari, if you like a fast, nice car, or not, buy a Ferrari. I mean, I wish I could buy a Ferrari. I mean, but the point I'm making is that one of the guys who was driving there, his Ferrari, he made a point of saying, yes, I have a Ferrari because the Ferrari makes clear who's a boy and who's a man, right? And that is what that's the kind of stuff I'm thinking. Okay, I mean, if a guy explicitly says that having a Ferrari makes clear that he's a man, not a boy, right? He's basically using the fact that he has a symbol of achievement and symbol of status to prove his maturity, masculinity, and as achievement, etc. Which I would argue is a bit is a bit pathetic, right? Because basically that's the point I'm making, and that is that is a sign, I would say, of mobilizing function in the as extroverted sensing, right? So basically, I mean, I would say that somebody who has achieved or has the money enough to buy a Ferrari and go to Monaco as something, of course, that arguably that is enough, right? Now, if such a person feels the need to not only to look at how rich and successful I am, I have a Ferrari, and even face this way, okay, it shows everybody I'm a man, not a boy. I would say that this is a manifestation. Now, this guy, in my personal, one of the cases, I mean, people may disagree whether this is a valid example, but I am doing that. This is an example of somebody being slightly pathetic, right? Because the guy is very obviously showing that he sees a Ferrari as a source of validation. Now, that I think is different from what you mean is validation, right? Because I think it might be meaning validation in the sense of explicitly asking confirmation from other people about
exactly,
right? Which is something is slightly, this guy, that my example, he in a way he's needing validation, but on the other hand, he is already thinking that this is a proof, or that's enough validation, if you know what I mean.
It sounds like he's created his own norm to say, I am this,
yes,
I'm a man, right? And he's almost challenging anyone to suggest he isn't. So, and in that respect, I think it is very much, again, fits into the idea of an inert or stubborn function. He wants to own this definition. He wants to be his definition. Anyone's going to try and suggest he's not. He's going to challenge that. Whereas I think the validation, which I thought initially, of someone going to someone else and asking, tell me, am I good at this or am I not? That is far more flexible and far more about, I don't know how to form norms in this area. can you provide the norms and the decision making of the parameters by which I am up here or just down there?
Yeah. And another example, right, which I have observed personally in many cases, right, is in the case of technical salespeople. Right now, a technical salesperson is almost like a contradiction in terms, because no. I mean, look, I have worked in this field, so but I mean, because on the one hand, right, the classical skill for a salesperson is more related to extroverted, more related to extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing, maybe extrovert or introverted feeling has to do with engaging individuals and persuading them that they should buy something from you. Now, however, the more technical the product or the business you're trying to sell becomes, less important this aspect of emotions or introvert or relations becomes. It is always remains important, but it becomes less important. And then, of course, for instance, right, if you are selling something which is really very technical, I mean, if you're really trying to, you have to be able to discuss at a very technical level what you are selling, and the relationship becomes less important, because people might say, okay, you are a nice guy, you are very persuasive, but at the end of the day, I can see that you don't really understand what I'm talking about, right? And in what I have observed in technical salespeople, of precisely the types of who have, especially types which are SCE and IEE, and those types, they have extroverted thinking as their mobilizing function and extroverted feeling as aid function. And so SCE and IEs are types that find it very easy, the traditional sales role of engaging with people at an emotional level and developing a relationship and making a persuasive case. They find it very natural. However, they they are often very good technical salespeople. However, and what I've noticed, and I've noticed that many times, because I've worked into this area, and so it's not just one or two examples, is that when they give a presentation on the product, SEs and IEs, they are prone to putting into their presentations way more information than it is needed or advisable, right? Something that is impossible for people to follow, but because they don't feel confident in choosing what is essential information and what is less essential information. So they just, okay, I have to put everything, right?
Yes.
That's a very common trait. I mean, because they lack the confidence, they don't. I think at some level it is okay if I don't put everything. People will think that I don't know everything, right? So put everything, but it tends, on a practical level, it works against them, because obviously, if you put too much information, people don't actually listen to it, right? They basically people don't absorb it. So it is this kind of stuff, this kind of trait that I am referring to.
I also, for people who are familiar with some of my interviews, my interview with Shane, I think, is a very good example of an SCE who is specifically in technical sales and has to negotiate that balance between the more charismatic rapport building and the delivery of practical factual information to solve problems for the person in making a sale. I think Florian as well is another SE I've interviewed who has worked in technical sales. So yeah, no, and it's very interesting to see that manifestation of extroverted logic as the mobilizing function for them and their particular struggle they can have.
Because there is a big difference into, because of course in this kind of jobs you have to know as much as possible, obviously. However, there's a big difference between being able to answer every question that the person might have and already present the person with tons of information to begin with, right?
Yes.
And that's it. And that is and basically actually another way of explaining what I mean, of explaining what I mean with this story about of overdoing it on the mobilizing function or being pathetic or something. Another way to maybe to phrase it would be to say trying too hard, right? With mobilizing function, we tend to either try too hard or maybe try too little. It's difficult to find a proper balance. I'm not saying it's impossible. Yeah. Obviously, it's more difficult, right?
Yeah.
And that is why sometimes this behavior can become. You don't look like, usually you don't look like you're trying too hard when you are operating on your ego functions or even your 8 and 7-8 function. You look like you're trying too hard when you are operating in your 6th or even the 5th function. So, but more so in the mobilizing function. So that's precisely what I mean. You're trying it. For instance, another example, it is in the case of SLEs or ILEs, where the extroverted or the 6th function is extroverted feeling.
Yeah.
And that is precisely the behavior of SLEs and ILEs, who often they try too hard to be funny or to be liked by everybody, to be the funny or popular guy in a room, right? So very often SLEs and ILEs are quite funny and popular guys in a room, but of course they too often they tend to try too hard in doing that, and that is and unfortunately for them, sometimes they come across as jerks or jackasses doing that, unfortunately, right? And that's what I'm talking about, right? This kind of, but and that's besides what I think is useful for typing. An ILE on an SLE is far more likely to look very obviously as if they're trying too hard to be funny or popular or being liked by everybody.
Yeah.
Then, for instance, then an LSE or an LE, right? So, yeah. And especially since we are often have this discussion about, since going back to this kind of discussion, if we were to focus only on the ego functions, it would be very, very hard to differentiate quasi-identicals, because, and they're already very hard to differentiate, right? Because quasi-identicals, they have exactly the same functions. The 1st, the 2nd, and the 7 and the 8. They're the same functions, not in the same order, of course, but but their strongest functions are the same, the strongest elements. If you're always going to focus on the obviously visible stronger functions, it would be very difficult to differentiate quasi-identicals. However, when you see, but if you have the opportunity, and if you observe the person just very briefly, maybe it's very difficult, of course. Anyway, but if you have a chance to observe the person in longer term, you can see how this person tends to behave like how's behaving in trying too hard. And for instance, now to see to my examples now that I've already used, an LIE who has the extroverted sensing as a mobilizing function would be far more likely than an ILE to be susceptible about being competitive about personal achievement or professional achievement or material achievement. I mean, maybe even the case of that Ferrari guy, right? An LIE would be more likely to become to look very obviously, okay, the guy is trying to prove that he is successful or accomplished or strong than an ILE, while an ILE would be far more likely to be the funny and popular guy in a given circle than an LIE, right? So so that is one reason, I think, to be aware of this distinction, of the fact that the mobilizing function can pop sometimes into vision in a sort of try too hard, pathetic, or as I mentioned earlier, foolish way. So that is pretty much my message here.
I would also add, because I agree with what you say, but I would also add that sometimes the role function could look like someone's trying too hard, but they're not actually taking it seriously. And it can be sort of like a boast or a, sort of making fun of oneself. Whereas I don't feel that people tend to make fun of oneself in the mobilizing function as readily, because I think that's where they take the area quite seriously.
Sorry, could you elaborate?
Well, for instance, I would say an LIE is wanting to, is more likely to take quite seriously the idea that they are successful, that they are someone who's quite formidable in what they've achieved and that they've done with their impact. Whereas an ILE could say show off their physicality in the way which is not really to be taken seriously, but more as a sort of joke.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and not sure if I am visualizing it.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm just thinking of examples of that. So, for instance, I think people are watching, say, Boris Johnson as an example, say Vanilli, where role extroverted sensation, mobilizing extroverted ethics. He can quite clearly be trying too hard in the extroverted ethics area, trying to be a bit too, trying to be likable, or trying to inculcate a certain image which comes across in a certain way to others. And for him, it will be a deliberately sort of, what's the word, scruffy image. But certainly he's showing that he's thinking very much about how he's coming across to others and trying to create some sort of effect. Meanwhile, in doing that, he can be doing lots of sort of quite jokey displays of strength and capability, even to the extent of playing American football and knocking over a poor Japanese child, or doing other sorts of ridiculous displays of his physicality. I'm saying to someone who's actually watching that and trying to.
I don't know, because I think this case. Hey, I don't know, because I don't know, because what I say about this is that I mean, that to at least by those people, the politicians.
Ooh, it's gotten quite freezy there.
Of course, they do it in different ways, right?
Yeah.
In the case of, for instance, people like, well, to stick it to British politics, people like, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn, he doesn't alter his behavior, and he doesn't actively look for popularity or being loved in this way. What he does is he sticks to his principles, or his stated principles, and he essentially expects people to reach people who like him, who agree with him, essentially, right? And kind of populistic, extravagant behavior, which he has always done, right? Which goes from all of being basically doing this popular appearance, etc. Where he appears buffoonish on purpose because that's part of his appeal.
Yes.
And what it has to do with what I mean, of course, we don't know without asking him or in his mind. The question really would be to which extent he himself realizes how often his behavior comes across as being buffoonish. Right? He may well just think, oh, okay, I just appear as a fun guy who is very creative, who is quirky and full of ideas, and who's willing to sometimes to risk doing foolish things, but he doesn't realize really how many people see that as being putting because it's undignified and ridiculous. So with physics, no, right? He doesn't seem to come out of his way to appear like a tough guy, right?
Yeah.
He comes across the fact that he gets involved into playing sports, etc. I think it is because this is just one facet of what he does. Pretty much, I think he does everything he can think of to appear to call attention to himself. He doesn't.
Yeah.
The physicality doesn't seem to be a specific focus, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, I think so.
For instance, I think it would be different. Okay, I cannot right now. I cannot think of specific examples of present day politics. But you would be one, I think, who any politician who wants to present himself
Peter, it's very hard to understand what you're saying right now. The connection's gone
to athletics
very
and sports, and actually, but
I can't understand anything you're saying, Peter. The connection's gone very unstable.
It's better. Yeah, it's better now.
A bit better. Yeah, it's a bit better. So you're saying?
Okay.
You're giving an example of something. Not sure
Actually,
what.
I have an example. Sorry.
You're saying you're thinking of an example of
example
something. I'm not sure what though.
Okay. The example would be of politicians more likely to focus on the physicality as manifestation of their mobilizing function.
Yes.
Right. And I just thought of an example. You had the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy.
I knew you were going to say him.
Because he is an LAE, I think.
Yeah.
And he didn't at all behave in any way which would be like Boris Johnson, which is sort of more buffonish way. He actually, but he did try to have an image of being very athletic, right? So basically, he was always jogging, always riding his bike, etc. Of course, he genuinely liked to do that, obviously, right? But he also made a point of doing that in a way that you always be photographed or filmed like that. So and his image of being not only very energetic, always hyperactive, but always doing athletic things, right? Whether it was he's jogging or cycling or playing football or whatever it was, right? Which one could argue that possibly it was also compensation because he was obviously because he wasn't a big man. He isn't a big man, but it would also be a manifestation that precise because of this, maybe he felt the need, okay, I have to show that I'm tough, that I'm strong, that I'm athletic, etc., which is not what, but he always was very careful, Sarkozy, or to appear to not to fall into he always avoided making fun of himself or risking being obviously funny or even buffoonish in the way Boris Johnson is. Boris Johnson risks being buffoonish in order to be popular and being able to things. And Sarkozy, he wanted to be seen as tough and strong.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. However, it wasn't the but it is not the main appeal of, it is not the cornerstone of Boris Johnson's personality of being a buffoonish, because people, it is because he's seen as a guy who is full of ideas, creative and flexible, etc. And in the case of Sarkozy, it wasn't because it was because he is supposed to be a guy who was going to fix up France, etc. And so that is the I would say this might be good examples of how LIEs and ILEs would differentiate on that.
That makes sense. I wonder how you would see, say, extrovert intuition show up as a mobilizing function, say in LSEs and DSEs.
I confess, this is one which I find difficult as well, right? And find it of right now I cannot think of public figures that I could point an example. I would say that a manifestation, of course, would be from LSE and ESD and LSE would be a person who is essentially a person whose strengths are in more conventional areas, however, also displays a sort of underlining attempt of being creative or being able in several different areas, right? But that to be something which is more subdued than in the case of an LE, where it comes natural.
Yeah.
I confess, but I will be I would now it doesn't occur to me any actual any. I can tell you that I think that at a personal level, I can tell you that it's not an uncommon behavior for ESEs, for instance, to be the kind of person who keeps having different has different hobbies of some kind, right?
Yes.
But I mean, let's say an example would be the typical ESE who has an ordinary 9 to 5 day job, etc., which can be something stereotypically boring, like being an accountant or something. But then, if you inquire further, this person has a lots of variable hobbies, right, which may not change very much, etc. Right, that would be a manifestation of that. So the is another something else that you have to know the person closely before you spot it, right? That would be a manifestation of it.
I see. Makes sense.
In the case, go on.
Oh, one thing I've noticed is that I can think of a number of examples of introverted logic as a mobilizing function in IEIs, but I'm only recently started to think about how that would really show up in, say, an SEI, because I think it doesn't show so much.
Again?
I've been thinking, I know of a few examples, say, of IEIs with mobilizing introverted logic. Only more recently have I started to really try to get to the nub of what it's like for, say, an SEI. And having a fiance who's an SEI, picking out where it might show up for her. Because I don't think many SEIs are inclined to have some sort of, I don't know, some sort of ideology or some sort of structured way of thinking in terms of their ideas, where they may be more stubborn. And I thought about how can that appear perhaps in a more concrete sort of way. And it's recently I've noticed, say, with my fiance, where she gets most sort of irritated is if I or other people who she knows are doing things around her that she feels to be wrong-headed in that particular moment. Like, she got especially irritated at me when my first attempt at cooking, she asked me to weigh a rice, and I took out some scales and I started trying to pour the rice onto the scales to measure them. She got very, very irritated at that, because you went to put it in a bowl, put a bowl on the scales first and weigh the rice by putting it in the bowl. It's that sort of thing which to her seems like common sense, which I wasn't showing.
So if I break up a bit, I hope you can hear me well. Now, you're saying that is in a sense that she preferred to follow procedure very precisely.
Oh, it wasn't necessarily procedure in terms of some sort of official procedure, but I think it is an idea that no, you don't do it that way, you do it this way, and that I wasn't doing it. I was doing it in a obviously very stupid way, and she got very frustrated by that. Or usually it's around things in the kitchen, in a space. If I'm doing something in a way which is wrong, she'll get very frustrated very quickly, and she can get very frustrated at other people who are doing those things.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm not sure, because I think that being confident with different ways of doing something, and it can be preparing food, or it can be anything. It can be how you fix a device, or how you
Yes.
how you if you are fixing a piece of equipment, you don't have anything at hand, and then you just improvise a quick fix, right, which is not the proper one, but is an emergency. These kind of things, they are more for the thing, they come more natural for people who are more confident that they understand thoroughly what they're doing, and are more confident into their ability to find new ideas. I think that, for instance, sticking to food, to cooking, without getting any particular example, obviously there will be ways of cooking or recipes, etc., where you say put ingredient A and then put ingredient B, and in many cases it doesn't make really a difference to anything whether you put B before A, right?
Yes.
In some cases there will be a difference, because they mix or react or wherever you put it. In many cases there won't be any difference, but of course you only feel confident about changing this if you thoroughly understand what is going on there. And I think that for not only SCIs, but for people who feel more confident, okay, I'll know that following this procedure like this works. I'm not confident that if I change something in between, that it's not going to be much worse. They prefer just, okay, I'll just know that this particular way of doing it works, so I just stick to it, right?
I can see that. I can see that happening as well. For instance, when I ever make Zara coffee, she insists I put the milk in first and then the coffee. And so I put the milk in first with the coffee and then add in the hot water. And I was only thinking to myself, what difference does it make? Although I think there must be some sort of difference, because she can always tell.
Okay, look, I'll be surprised if there. I think there's something else going on there, because obviously, if you, to say the obvious, if you first dissolve the coffee into water.
Yes.
Right, in hot water, dissolved, and then you add the milk, and then you mix it, right? And if the end result is that all of them are very well dissolved and mix, you have the same thing, right? You don't have any sort of reaction there between the two. Now, what I think there is a difference is that if you put, there might be a difference in terms of the temperature, right? Because if you put, I think what that may happen is the following: if you put the hot water on top of the coffee, and you put the milk on top, and then mix it, no matter how well you mix it, very possibly the top would remain a bit colder, because what you put last was the colder milk, while if you put the hot water as last, then you're more likely to have the hotter bit on top. That's the only thing you can think of, really.
Wouldn't the heat rise up anyway?
Sorry?
Wouldn't the hotter parts rise up to the top?
Not necessarily. Well, it is not the same as air, right? In hot air, yes, but if you're mixing, if you are mixing, I mean, look, you can do that. You can try that even in if you put first cold water and then hot water on top.
Yeah.
If you put hot water and then you put liquid and you put cold something on top, and if you just casually mix it,
yeah,
right, the liquid water on the bottom is not going to mix as quickly with the top. It will eventually, right, but not immediately. So you have to put an extra effort. In the case, it is not the heat that goes up; it is the actual hot air that goes up, right? In the case of hot water does not go up. Hot water stays there. So either you mix it well, so that you mix the hot water with the cold milk, so they all reach the same temperature, or if you wait a long time, the heat itself from conduction is going to go from one bit to the other, right? But it doesn't rise in the same way of air, right? That's the point I'm making. So maybe I think it is something like that. The reason why you can tell is because I would imagine that if you actually make a point of, if you do it the other way, but if you make a point of really mixing, I would think the result to be the same, because there isn't anything else going on there.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense.
You see what I mean?
Yes, exactly. It's
sorry?
Yeah, exactly. It's not air. It's going to mix up differently. It's going to be, there's no guarantee it's going to just simply rise up to the top at the same rate as, say, air does. It will take a bit longer for any sort of equal distribution.
Yeah. I do think that SCIs, generally speaking, right, they are working in doing jobs that that require doing things precisely. They probably, generally speaking, prefer to follow procedure, right? Because they are not so confident that it will to come out right if you change it, unless of course somebody does it and it is provable that is better, and then of course they'll change it. I'll type that is more confident, rightly or wrongly, that they understand all the things. They might think, okay, it doesn't matter if I do A, B, C, O, D, A, B, C, D, or if I do A, C, D, B, they just do it, right? While I mean, I had this experience with my father, who's an SCI, a long time ago, right? Is that I think that he basically there was a condition which he was basically he was told by the guy who installed that he had to switch it on carefully by pressing one button and the other, not to press the two at a time, because if you did the same time, then it could burn it. But then he also took that to understand that he had to switch them off in the same direction at the same time. And then I said, no, look, I mean, if you switch them off, you just cut the power. You're not going to burn anything or overload it. You just cut the power. But of course, no, you have to follow. You have to do it straight, and if you do it, you may risk it, etc. Right? And so it's just an example of this. But I don't think that this is really. I don't think that is necessarily as a manifestation of the mobilizing function. I don't think that's the case. I think
it's more vulnerable.
I think it would be a more classical manifestation of the force function, really, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. The vulnerable function.
Sorry?
Exactly. It's more related to the vulnerable function than the mobilizing function.
Yeah, no, it's not. I don't think it's mobilizing function.
Yeah.
It's more like the vulnerable function. Correct. Vulnerable function.
Yeah, exactly.
The mobilizing function is seen really in. I think that the mobilizing function in the case of SCIs is also seen in professional choices, right? For instance, a person who might be an SCI who would be maybe a typical SCI often also shows inclination for going into in some sort of a study of mathematics as a hobby or something, because they prefer that than auto physics, right? Because they if they can understand a field which is very clearly more scientific, they find that as a personal achievement, right? So but sometimes only, sometimes professionally, sometimes as a hobby, but it goes against maybe what you'd find of the person as a general personality.
I haven't necessarily seen that yet in the SCIs I know, but that's probably because they're just the SCIs I know, as I haven't seen them taking on some sort of academic discipline as an area of pride in them.
Yeah, but I mean, let's put it this way, right? Because I'm not saying, I would say that I'm talking about how noticing this interest in mobilizing function would be a good way of spotting between quasi-identicals, right? That would be, for instance, an interest in this kind of studies I mentioned would be more likely to be found than in ESIs, I think.
Yes. No,
right.
That's yeah.
So that's the things. That's one of the things I'm making, right? But I mean, okay. But look, I mean, I think that yeah. So yeah. I mean, anyway. I mean, I've seen anything else. I mean, now I'm sort of.
Should we? I think there are a few questions remaining which people have asked, but maybe we can run through them. So a few of them have already been answered just in our discussion. Oh yeah, so first of all, Damon asked if that is true regarding what I said about the inert function for the mobilizing function. Would you see the same ownership from the vulnerable function, or would it be dismissed entirely? I'd say to that, it's basically been dismissed entirely. It's rather than, I think it's more of a valued form of inertness to say, right, this is my thing, I'm leading in this. Whereas when it comes to something which is unvalued, one more cautious rather than bold, this is where it's more, I'm having nothing to do with this. So it's still an inertness and stubbornness,
yes.
just not one of ownership, more of rejection.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the difference is that if we I don't think, I think the difference is the following, basically. The mobilizing function covers stuff that we feel or we wish we were better at than we are, or try to convince ourselves that we are better than we really are. Well, a vulnerable function is something that, given a choice, we'd rather not deal with it at all. It's something that we don't think is important. We don't think if we have to focus on mobilizing function because of social professional reasons, we can do it, but we resent it. We basically think, okay, why do I have to bother with this? Somebody else should do it. This is, and I basically think I said it, but I have no problem with it because it is stupid. I think that's the difference in attitude.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think there's another question. Here we go. Another one from David. How would you say that the mobilizing compensates for the vulnerable public demonstration? So what I think about that is, as far as the super ego and the super id relate to each other in terms of private and public, I would say it's that the vulnerable is seeing something that's just coming from the outside, coming from society, the world around us. It's an expectation on us, which we don't adjust adequately to. Whereas the super id, it's more about the inside going outside. So, for instance, not even necessarily going outside, but can be. But the idea where we have our ambitions, the areas which we want to work on, we want to develop, we want to grow in. It makes sense that would be something that's more private, more toward from us, for us. And you compare, contrast it to say the id in the ego. That's where it's something which we're bringing to the world, something which we are, which is clearly is apparent about us. The ego block, whereas the id block is something we're more doing for ourselves when it's needed, but we don't like to draw much attention to it because we don't actually value it or think it's important, which is what I think the id block is. So I think that's how I think, say, public and private cover all 4 blocks. I think it's it does involve looking at it in a different way for the ego versus the id versus the superego versus the super id. Yes. Any other questions here? As a building on that, David's also asking, how do you say that the mobilizing is private yet boldly displayed and often confused for an ego function? Well, I think it's because what you're seeking with a mobilizing function is your own sense that you are good at it. That can come from other people responding to the way that you expect. You may be seeking, you may be challenging others to try and tell you that you're not good in that area, but you're doing it for yourself. You're doing it for your own sense of goodness in this area, I would say. So I think it's still private, but yes, it does become more complicated when you see these things acted upon, and even some attention is drawn to it in the more public sphere. But I don't think that's really the point of it. Do you have any thoughts about that, Peter?
One moment.
That's okay. You can answer in Morse code if you wish. Okay. Having connection difficulties. But yeah, so basically, Damon, I think it does get more complicated than how the dichotomies would necessarily describe. But I think that as the ego is something which you're already confident in, you're already capable in, and it's what you're most seen as bringing to the world, I think the mobilizing function is more something where you are still trying to benefit yourself.
Am I online? I think
you're back. You are back. I can see you.
Yeah, I think I was disconnected. Am I back online?
Yeah, you're back online. I can see you. You're fine.
Okay. Hopefully to be a bit better now. Yeah, sorry. I couldn't really get a question.
It was, how would you say that the mobilizing function is private yet boldly displayed and often confused for an ego function? Why is it the ego is public yet the mobilizing function is private?
I don't think it is often confused for an ego function, right? I think I don't think it's confused for an ego function. I think that to be I think it to be a rare case where you confuse it for an ego function if you have the opportunity to observe the person over a long period of time. Now, to go back to an example I said before, if you just happen to see, for instance, an SLE or an ILE in a social event trying to overuse the extroverted these mobilizing functions, which is the extroverted feeling function.
Yeah.
And that's all you see from this person on this particular event. You might, this person uses so much E, although not very well, but okay, I guess this person uses so much E, it must be a strong function, ego function. I think you would only confuse it if you, in specific occasions, if you have the opportunity to observe this person over a long period of time, or a longer period of time, you would see that this is not really the main focus or the main mode of this person. So the mobilizing function can appear as appears in blips, right? The problem is not to mix up the blips with,
Yes.
And is not to extrapolate the blip into something which is more longer term, right? I mean, these days, unfortunately, we seem to have to use Donald Trump as an example. But in Donald Trump's case, which I say he's a typical SLE,
Yeah.
obviously a large part of his persona is about has been about bragging about himself, and I mean, even before he became a politician, when he started getting into becoming a media celebrity, often display of his success, and which is quite tacky. Obviously, his liking for public acclaim, his obviously enjoys of being surrounded by admirers, etc., etc. And one could say, okay, then this guy is obviously focused on extra.
Ah, Peter, you gone again? Nah. Ah, well. Yeah. Let me see if I can answer any more questions while I'm waiting for Peter. Oh, Peter's back. Right. I'll remove middle Peter. Hang on.
Sorry, I sorry.
There we go.
I didn't. I seem disconnected from you again.
That's okay. You're back. It's fine.
Yeah. So, but yeah, just to finish what I was saying. But obviously, but if you observe him, especially if you go to his earlier interviews going back 30 years, right? He obviously, and even today, right? He has a different mode where he talks more calmly and more details, especially when you used to talk about real estate in his early years. I mean, 30 years ago, right? So, and actually 30 years ago, when you'd appear on TV talking about real estate, he didn't seem to use extroverted feeling at all, right? He was far more content, and then later. So I think that's one of the things I'm saying. You have to look at a person over a long period of time. If you do see a person very briefly in specific,
Oh, it's paused again.
use.
Peter, I lost quite a bit of what you said there, but I think I know what you're saying. I would agree with. I think it's related to what they call the evaluatory situational dichotomy, and how the mobilizing function being more situational, I call more variable, it isn't always going to be on and present compared to the leading function.
Yes, yeah.
And that when it isn't switching on, the default is going to be actually more demonstrative function with leading function. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that you would confuse the mobilized function for the leading function if you observe someone over time. You'll see people fluctuating between the mobilizing and the demonstrative. I don't think you see them doing the same fluctuation with the leading. No,
that's very well put. Yes, that's exactly it.
When there is movement away from the leading function, it's towards the role function, and that's a very uncomfortable and very short-term movement, I would say, even more of a blip than the mobilizing function.
Yeah,
Movement.
although I want to, if I can comment on that, I think that the role function is essentially what makes us more human, I would say, right?
Yeah.
Because it brings us closer to most people. And by that, I mean the following. I mean, imagine somebody who only used extroverted thinking all the time without using extroverted feeling. That would be a robot, to be a complete robotic person, right?
Yes.
And somebody who would only use extroverted feeling without any extroverted thinking, it would be the typical, I don't know, rock star celebrity or artistic personality who always seem to be on that artistic emotional mode, doesn't seem to actually be saying anything which is more down to earth or objective. Of course, most people, they are halfway, right? Because obviously, even a person who is focused will moderate that with extroverted feeling on a day-to-day basis, and that goes for instance, right? An example that I like to use, let's say extroverted logic, introverted logic, right? Imagine a policeman who's an LSI and who did not have any introverted feeling. It would be the guy who would fine anyone, even the guy who happened to speed a little bit because he was late taking his pregnant wife to or something like that, right? To be the LSI who would never give a break to anybody, no matter what circumstances. And of course, in real life, LSIs are not like that. They make a lot of exceptions. They also bend the rules for special cases if they feel that justifies it, right? So that so that's the role function is your ability or inclination to move away from the leading function a bit, and because and that is precisely why nobody only uses a lead function without moderating it with the role function. And that is, and again, I mean, it goes back to, I think, a misconception, which is that you always focus on the lead functions, depending on the social occasion, right? An EIE may feel the need of focusing a lot on the extroverted thinking function, and vice versa for an LIE, right? And depending on situation, you might mix up the two. So it's, but of course, if you look at them over a long period of time, or if you look at them when they can be themselves, that's when you are more likely to observe their real preferences.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you got to be able to look across situations to find underlying behavioral trends rather than just stick to one behavior in one situation. I think that's how you tell the difference between the 2D and the 4D functions, you could say.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it.
Oh, someone's asked, apparently, Peter, we look very much alike and have a very similar fashion. So someone's asking, what if we have the same type and same Enneagram? Well, I'd say to that we'll be quasi-identicals in socionics. I don't know Peter's Enneagram, actually. I know, Peter, you had trouble working out your type in the Enneagram. None of them really fit you.
Yeah, okay, we can talk about it if you want. No, I think I think the Enneagram has a blind spot regarding extroverted thinking, actually, and if you look into all of the types and how they're defined, there isn't anyone there which is typically about extroverted thinking. You not in its essence, right? But when I there was a time when I would for a long time I would, if I had to type myself as an Enneagram type, I would say I would say I was to be a 8 with on the 9 wing, but I was never because the 8, of course, the 8 has is a more extroverted sensing focus, which is not my main focus. So, but to give an answer, when I look at types and when I test or if I study it, probably, and even if it doesn't make any sense in terms of triads or whatever, probably my types are a mix of 1, 5, and 8. Right, I can say that I definitely have nothing much. I can definitely have nothing. The types that have nothing to do with me, obviously, are 2, 9, 7, and 4. 6 is a type that I can see that many Enneagram or people who work on an Enneagram, they have an inclination, I think, to use 6 as a sort of a default type for people who don't fit well with other types. Basically, okay, if you don't fit any other types, you have to be a 6. Have noticed this?
I've seen some of that. Yeah, I have.
Yeah. And of course, then to make it more complicated or to more broaden, they say that you have the 6, which is I forgot how they call it, which is the counter. Sorry?
Counterphobic.
Yeah, because okay, the 6 would be a type which has a sort of anxiety, but if you're not anxious and you just fight your anxiety, you're counterphobic, and that starts to lose track of where you are. And then you have the type 3, which is the achiever, and my problem with type 3 is that the original description of Enneagram clearly put type 3 as someone who is not so much interested in achievement per se, is somebody who is interested in having the image of having achievement. The one person who wants social validation, for instance. Some of those people who are the extreme survival types, or people who just want to be hermits, they might consider it their achievement in life to be able to survive alone in the middle of nowhere with no human contact. But that would probably rule out a type 3, because a type 3 would want to have their achievements validated by others, which to me suggests that the type 3 is more closely related to some very specific kinds of EIEs. The kind of EIEs who are more focused on a corporate life or this kind of thing, and of course not EIEs are like that. So yeah, so that's pretty much. So basically, yeah, so I studied Enneagram a lot at some point, but I, as I said, I reached the conclusion that it doesn't really cover types as completely as socionics does. So I sort of lost interest.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I would be interested in having Kat maybe give you an Enneagram interview at some point. I would be curious about that.
Sorry, again.
So that's for another day. I would be curious about my friend Kat giving you an Enneagram interview someday. Sure. I would even be willing to pay for that. I'm curious, but that's for another day.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I suspect that okay, I mean, I've already said what my problems are. Yes, we can do that sometime if you want.
Yes. Yeah, that'll be good. That'll be cool. Jacob asks a very good question, something which you've already done some work in, Peter, which is how can you use the mobilizing function to tell apart mirror types?
To tell apart which types?
To tell apart mirror types.
A mirror.
Yeah.
Sorry? Mirror types.
How can you use the mobilizing function to tell apart mirror types?
Yeah. Basically, well, fundamentally, because the mobilizing function of the one is the suggestion function of the other, and generally speaking, you are more likely to overcompensate or exaggerate your use of the mobilizing than of the suggestive. However, right? Again, I mean, that you have to, this is something you have to observe over the longer period of time, right? For instance, in the case of LI and ILI, right, mirror types, maybe during a short term, if you know the person, you may not be able to spot, depending what in stage of their lives. But for instance, I would say that the LI is more likely to be a person who focuses more on career and achievement and leaves aside the relationships and family side for it. And the ILI is more likely to be the opposite, right? So the ILI is more likely to find to one day focus more on a relationship and family, etc., than on their long-term professional achievement. Of course, many we have some measure of success in both. Then it's not always so easy. I think an ALI is much less likely to be subjected to sort of needs to focus or brag about achievement or success, or even to feel a sort of need or feel a need to comment on that. ILIs are much more chill about these things, right? But I mean, it's not. That's what I can say, right? If you're in doubt about an ILI and an LI, for instance, and you spot that this person sometimes seems to focus more on extroverted sensing, more likely as an LI. I can say the same thing about, for instance, an EIE or an II, where it is introverted logic. An II is more likely to be one with pretensions of having of pretensions of intellectual focus, or an EIE will be less likely. I mean, so again, I mean, it's something to discuss on a case by case, right? So the question is, yes, to go back to my original point. Sure, I mean, if you can spot on a person what is the sort of unusual thing that they seem to focus on occasion, and if you can identify that as being related to a particular function, whether it is extroverted sensing or extroverted or introverted thinking or introverted feeling, then there's a good chance that is the mobilizing function and not the suggestion function, and that is a hint how to differentiate the mirrors.
No, I pretty much agree with all you said there, Peter.
Sorry?
I pretty much agreed with all you said there, Peter. I have a very similar viewpoint on that. I think those are all the questions which people have asked, which haven't already been discussed or covered in our conversation. So,
Yeah. I mean, the problem is that unfortunately, right, and that's a general comment which I always make is that in socionics you have the theory, and you can of course get very deeply involved in the theory about pretty much what some of the points that we discussed now, which are very theoretical.
yes.
But at the end of the day, they are only useful if they can be connected to actual individuals or given types, right? Because there is, it makes, I personally think it is not very helpful if you have a very good abstract view of what the types are, of what the elements are, if you cannot connect them correctly to real life individuals.
Yes.
Which means, and of course, that's become the tricky part, because that is only works if you can type real life individuals as accurately as possible, and that's sometimes very difficult. And that's precisely one of the points I'm making, is that when you try to type individuals, you have to use all the tools at your disposal, because if you just focus on a person and you see the person focusing on okay, this person focusing more on this element and this other, therefore they're obviously their ego functions, then okay, I've already typed the person. I think that will lead to mistakes, because you really have to observe a person over a longer period of time in many social situations to see the actual type there.
Yeah, I think that's very, very wise.
And this mobilizing function is another tool. The mobilizing function behaviors I mentioned, they're just
Yes.
another tool in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they are good ways for looking at a type in terms of their growth and development over time. I think the more something I've been thinking about even today is the way I would like socionics and the diagnostics of type to evolve over time is by really focusing on how people shift within their type with certain focuses and behaviors and development. What does a healthy LIE look like compared to an unhealthy LIE? They should look quite different. They should be focusing in different sorts of areas. And once you have that understanding of those dynamics of a type rather than just the statics of a type, you could say, then you can have more accurate typings. You can have types which are more applicable to a person rather than just typing someone based off one snapshot and hoping that snapshot is representative of the overall person.
Yeah. I want to give another example on the mirror question.
Yes.
For instance, let's take an SLE and an LSI, right? An SLE is far more likely to get into this kind of behavior where they're trying to be popular or funny or be liked, be the life of the party, etc. The LSI is far more likely to have a sort of more restrained and serious persona, right? Now, obviously, depending on situation, an SLE will have this more restrained and serious persona. But the point I'm making is that depending on what is going on, the SLE is more likely to go for this case where they would just want to suddenly to be the people which are the teachers or the popular people or etc. Right? That's the LSI is more far less likely. The LSI will tend to be more passive. The LSI can be or is often the person who is quite restrained and quite reserved, but if it is found in, let's say, in a very lively social atmosphere where they feel comfortable, like in a party, etc., where he knows everybody, then the LSI may become a part. Will drift into will become a party animal, and it might surprise people who don't know them elsewhere. But the LSI would be very unlikely to try to create this situation out of a revolution. While the SLE was more likely to try to on occasion elevate the extroverted feeling environment where they are, right? So that's the difference, right? Yeah, I mean, I could go through all of these types, but that's pretty much how you where it is one of the ways that you see it differently between mirrors.
Yes, that makes sense. I think that's all. I think that's all we have.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, so
so Peter, thank you very much for sharing your insights and wisdom on.
Yeah, it was something nice to do over a weekend while in lockdown.
It is nice to do. I think we should do some more. Maybe we can do some of the other functions in the future. Maybe we should do, if it's a demonstrative, maybe the role. I think those could be quite interesting to go into.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we can talk sure, whichever you find more interesting.
Okay, let's do that. Thank you,
Peter. Demonstrative, really. I mean,
yeah.
No, yeah. Sorry, we can talk about it later. Okay.
Okay. Well, we'll go to that's a good idea. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and see you all soon.
Bye.